Welcome, everybody. You are all cognitive winners for getting here, despite the confusion about the time. So you've negotiated the first puzzle. My name is David Brooks. I'm a columnist with the New York Times. My first contact with the Aspen Institute came while I was a student at the University of Chicago, and a fellow who was very important to running the Aspen Institute, or at least founding it, was a guy named Mortimer Adler, who wrote a book called 6 Great Ideas. And I wrote a piece about it for our college newspaper, and the headline, due to a mistranscribed conversation over the phone, was 6th grade ideas. And I've been dumbing down smart people ever since. It's a real pleasure to be here with Antonio Damasio, who is one of the leading scientists of the brain and social thinkers in the country today. I came upon his work very quickly because I till my plow in the world of politics. And after a while in the world of politics, you get a little tired of policies that don't work because they have an inaccurate view of human nature. In my world, economics is the gateway between the social sciences and policy. And one thing you are not allowed to talk about in Washington is emotion. We are an emotionally avoidant city. If you used the word love at a congressional hearing, they'd look at you like you're Oprah. And so I eventually decided it might be a good idea to get a more accurate vision of what human beings are like. And so that sent me, and I think it sent many people who were frustrated, off to a series of books, 3 of which have been written by Antonio. One is Descartes Error, which is tremendously important, one of the most cited books you come across if you read this literature, which we will talk about. The second is called The Feeling of What Happens, which is a very original look at the Moby Dick of neuroscience, which is how consciousness arises from the brain. And then the third book, and I think I have these in order, is called Looking for Spinoza. And many of us didn't even know he was lost, but there it is. And I'm going to start by asking you just to describe your genesis as a scientist, because I think the course of your career, and especially this first book that you wrote, marks not only a personal journey, but a shift in emphasis in the entire field. So could you describe what you were originally writing about when you first started, and then what led to this book, and how the field has shifted since?
Good. Well, thank you. Pleasure to be here. Maybe the best thing would be to talk about, to give you a proper answer, to talk about influences and then changes in course. In terms of influences, I'm a neurologist and a neuroscientist, so is Hannah, my wife, who's here. And we started our work under the influence, this was late 60s into the 70s, under the influence of a remarkable neurologist and neuroscientist called Norman Geschwin. He was a famous neurologist at Harvard who took the field of neuroscience in a completely new direction, and thinking about the lesion method, the study of behavior changed by neurological lesions, opened an entirely new vista on brain studies. And this happened in late 60s and 70s, and there was an enormous influence on our work. And we began by studying, very much like Norman Geschwin did, the phenomena of language and of memory. In fact, practically all our first studies were about what happens to the human brain when you have damage to the language processing areas, and you come across this phenomenon known as aphasia. And that was very important in our lives. Then something very important happened, which probably leads to the rest, and that is in the 1980s we came under the great influence of the Salk Institute. That's when our association with the Salk Institute began, and there was an association both with Jonas Salk and with Francis Crick. And I think it's very interesting because when you think about the glory times of science in the 20th century, this must certainly have been one of them, and it has to do with the sort of the late effects of the discovery of DNA structure and of the genetic code, and a completely new view of what human nature is when you connect it with its genetic and molecular origins. And spending many hours talking to both Jonas and to Francis Crick completely changed my views of what I was doing. And it also gave me something very important. It gave me a license to do theory. Because when you spend time with Francis Crick, who is easily the most important scientist of the 20th century, but never spent a day in a laboratory, and was through and through a thinker, theoretician, it really gives you an idea that you can contribute not only by doing regular experiments in a laboratory setting, but also by thinking about data that others have worked on and your own data in novel ways. So that was quite important.
Can I stop you there? Because one of the things that marks the books is, before we get to the substance, just the style of your writing, your thinking, is they're very literary, they're very philosophical. Were you, by most scientists' training, are they trained not to be as literary and philosophical as you've been until you meet someone like Crick?
I think that if you recognize that in the books, I think it has to do with something else. It has to do with my early life, actually not here, but in Portugal. You know, I grew up in Portugal, and I grew up in an environment where thinking about philosophy or the humanities was an absolute must. If you were going to be an educated person, if you were going to be a physician or an engineer, you still had to be preoccupied with those issues. And I think that's where it probably comes from. And by the way, medically, it was very interesting because this morning in this room we had a very interesting session about healthcare, and we were talking about these different roles that physicians assume now and must assume under the onslaught of technology. And one of the things that is very different in medical education throughout the world, and very different from what it used to be, say, 30, 40 years ago, is that there simply is no time for that human and humane aspect of the training of a physician, and that's gone practically everywhere. So that answers your that
okay,
question.
And now to the substance of how you shifted.
Final step is the fact that throughout the 1980s and then, of course, the 90s, we came across a number of cases that were extremely challenging. And basically what we were encountering was patients that had sustained damage to the brain as a result, for example, of a tumor or as a result of a stroke, who had, to make a long story short, this incredible dissociation. On the one hand, they had an inability to decide correctly in the social space. So the ability to make proper decisions, for example, regarding their finances or regarding their moral behavior in the broad ethical sense, had been impaired. On the other hand, they did not have any detectable intellectual deficits. So if you would measure their IQ by conventional means, if you would look at their language abilities, their learning capacity, and so on, their motor abilities, all of that was fine. And this was actually caused by a very small set of areas of damage in the brain, largely in the prefrontal cortex, but also in a couple of other areas in subcortical territories. What they did have, and it was really the most blatant aspect of their disturbances, was a disturbance of emotion. And so it was very interesting because it made us think that, well, there's something very odd here. You have a quote-unquote normal intellect for all intents and purposes. You have very abnormal decision-making, but largely at the level of the social encounters, the social relationships, all the way from interpersonal relationships to things that have to do with, again, finances, moral behavior, and so on. And then you have this disturbance of emotion. And that made us very, very interested in the issue of emotion. And we started doing work in this area. And eventually, over a period of very few years, we turned over all the work that had to do, for example, with facial processing or memory or language to other colleagues in the lab, and we concentrated mostly on the emotional side. And I'm glad we did it. It was difficult to do at first because the tradition in neuroscience had been to abandon studies of emotion altogether. And the first times that we mentioned in public that we were doing this, people said, well, you're going off the deep end. I mean, but why would you do it? You're doing so well in what you do. And we know perfectly well that emotion doesn't really count, and that's all over and done with. Look at what happened to William James. Besides, he was wrong. And that was the general attitude. And of course, as you know, this all has changed. And curiously, I think I've told you this once, in 1995, as late as 1995, the Society for Neuroscience, which is the largest group of neuroscientists on the face of the earth, had never had a session, a symposium on emotion. In fact, there had not even been a special lecture on the topic of emotion. And in 1995, myself and Joe Ledoux had a symposium on the neurobiology of emotion. 1995. This was 1 year after I published Descartes Error. And then, of course, these days, it's one of the growing aspects of the neurobiology business. There are sessions on emotion everywhere, in every meeting, and it obviously has done very well. But it was not at first terribly well received, largely because people did not think that after a century of rationalism, we needed to go from reason to emotion. And of course, we do.
Right. Now, I know you're bored of talking about this, but just to give a concrete example, which journalists like me think in, one of the most famous patients you had was a fellow named Elliot, who was a very successful person, suffered this damage, and whose life went down the tubes, basically made a series of terrible decisions. Another case that was always fascinating to me, the scene you describe in one of your books, one of your patients who also has trouble making decisions, and you're asking him, at what point should we schedule the next appointment,
Yep.
Tuesday or Wednesday? And as you describe it in the book, he spends, I think, 20 or 30 minutes saying, well, Tuesday has disadvantages, Wednesday has disadvantages, unable to make up his mind.
Right, exactly. And that is a very illustrative example because it shows you, on the one hand, that the cognitive abilities, the ability to manipulate data and to make analysis of costs and benefits in a very cold way is maintained. And people can still do that. Well, but the thing I most liked in these patients when we asked them about restaurants, and this was really quite remarkable. And they said, "What restaurant do you want to go to tonight?" And said, "Well, we could go to this one." And they said, "But I take it that this restaurant has been rather empty recently, so that's probably a bad sign. It's a sign that the food may not be so good. On the other hand, it's true that if it is more empty, we're likely to get a table, and therefore we should go there. But then, and the thing will go on endlessly until you really feel like pounding on the table and said, well, get real and choose." But the reason why they can't choose is that they haven't got this sort of lift that comes from emotion. It is emotion that allows you to mark things as good, bad, or indifferent, literally in the flesh. And it is that kind of emotional impetus that they are lacking. They cannot conjure up for a given situation an emotional state that would decide them in one direction or another. And of course, this is something that we all can relate to. We're constantly being swayed in what we do by just a little teeny change, something that comes, for example, from our past experience with a certain kind of situation. But what we remember from a previous situation that is like that is not just the facts, not just the outcome that it may be good or bad. We also remember whether or not what we felt was good or bad. And this is something that people need to understand, is that when you are making decisions any day of your life, and of course the options you make are going to produce a good or a bad outcome or something in between, you do not only remember what the factual result is, but also what the emotional result is. And that tandem of fact and associated emotion is critical. And of course, most of what we construct as wisdom over time is actually a result of cultivating that knowledge about how our emotions behaved and what we learn from them.
Right, and this is revolutionary to the way many of us think, because we have a concept handed down from Plato that the passions are these unruly things which reason controls. We have modern philosophers, a guy named Gene Roddenberry created a guy named Dr. Spock, who was supposed to be wise because he could purge emotion from his system. Even today, we'll hear people say, oh, he's thinking with his emotions, not with his brain, whereas you're saying intelligent decision-making is impossible without emotion because emotion is what marks the value and draws you toward this and that.
Right. But at the same time, it's very important to realize that it's not that we're saying that reason is not important, and that knowledge and logic are not important. On the contrary, what is important to say is that, first of all, you cannot have normal decision-making without the emotional factors, and certainly by the time you're an adult, without having all that wisdom that comes from your accumulated experience, especially if you reflected on the experience, and that categorization we make of what's good and bad, not only factually but also emotionally. That's one thing. But then you need to preserve the great advantages of knowledge and logic. And of course, the ideal situation is one in which you're using emotion up to a certain point, sometimes as a first guide into what you can do, and then you use the knowledge and the logic to literally test whether or not what you're trying to decide makes sense.
Right, and this is part of a key distinction you make between emotion and feeling.
Yeah.
Well, why don't you describe what that distinction is?
Well, the distinction between emotion and feeling is very important because most of the time we confuse the two. Most of the time, if you analyze your language, and if I analyze mine, because I think I'm better now, but I used to do the same thing, you very often talk about emotion, but you're really meaning feeling, or vice versa. So, I'm not trying to be pedantic and tell you that you're using language incorrectly, although most of the time we are. But let me tell you what the concepts are. These are research concepts, and I think they're very valuable to orient research. So, an emotion is really about action. And what emotion, the best definition that I can produce for you of emotions today, and this is based on our understanding of the problem, is that it is a collection of automated actions that are aimed at a particular effect that will have importance for the regulation of life. That automated package of actions, you could call it an action program, is something that has been installed in your brain at birth, obviously under the influence of a genome, with the enormous effect of many millions of years of evolution, and that is going to serve as like a little packet of rapid intelligence to make you solve a problem without you having to think about it. So, for example, if now there would be some cause of alarm and we would be under threat in this room, you know perfectly well what you would have. You would have a reaction of fear, and you would act on it. Typical reactions of fear include freezing in place or running away from the source of threat. But whatever they are, whatever the program is that is engaged, it's going to be a program of actions. Some of the actions are very visible. For example, in the face, you have a face of being in terror. You have a posture, there is the posture of fear. But then there are other things that happen. You have your heart rate that goes up, and you have the blood pressure that goes up, and you have your hypothalamus spritzing cortisol into your entire organism, and therefore changing a whole aspect of the economy of the interior of the organism. All of these are actions. Some are at the level of the endocrine system, some are at the level of the musculoskeletal system, some are at the level of the viscera, and some are at the level of the behavior we engage in. Like I said, freezing or running away from the source. All of this exists in many, many species, not just in humans. In fact, most non-human species, for example, when you think about birds or when you think about mammals, they have these reactions. In fact, you can go all the way to invertebrates and find examples of exactly the same thing. You can have a snail have a reaction of fear that is very similar to all of this. Now, we know perfectly well that the snail doesn't have a brain, very organized beside a few nuclei of neurons, that the brain the snail is unlikely to have a mind, let alone consciousness, let alone a sense of the culture. So obviously what we're dealing with is something that is evolutionary biological intelligence that is prepared to make an organism do the best it can without having to think about it that much. Now, we have this program in us, and we have it not just for fear, but we have it for sadness, anger, for joy. We have it also for a variety of emotions that we call social emotions. For example, embarrassment, shame, contempt, compassion, admiration, pride, guilt. All of these exist as prepackaged arrangements in the biology of your brain. What we then also have is this marvelous thing, is because we have a mind, and on top of it we have a mind that is conscious because we have a sense of self, we also have the possibility of having a perceptual take on what is happening in us. So when you have a feeling of fear, what that means is that your mind is representing what has changed in your organism while you are in the emotion of fear. And it is also because in humans things are very complex, we also have a number of thoughts, a number of scenarios that you bring up, and a number of cognitive strategies that you can engage. But the feeling part is sort of the capping of the process, and is something that exists in us, but does not necessarily exist in very low species.
Just to make sure I understand this, if I'm driving down the road, a car is coming at me, I swerve,
yeah.
I slam on the brakes, I feel my heart is palpitating,
yeah.
I feel breath coming in and out,
yeah.
and it's usually after I'm sitting on the side of the road that suddenly this wave, this conscious sense of fear comes
yeah.
over.
Exactly.
That comes later. So it's a two-stage.
It's a two-stage, right? Yeah, and the first, and of course, it's very good that all of this thing gets engaged without you having much control over it. Because if you were really pondering, well, what should I do? Now, you probably would react in a much more slow fashion, and of course, there would be a cost to that. And so the reaction is really happening largely at a non-conscious level, although it can very rapidly become conscious as well. But and in fact, one of the things that you may think, the reason why the distinction between emotion and feeling is so important is that emotion, by definition, to begin with, is non-conscious. So it was non-conscious throughout evolution and is still by and large non-conscious. And we learn about it through feeling. It's when we feel the emotion that we know that we had it. So feeling is sort of it's like the sea level that goes from this under the water operation, which is this very rich operation of the non-conscious brain, and the operations that suddenly emerge into consciousness.
Right.
Yeah.
I think there's such an important emphasis in the work because one of the revolutions we're having across all these spheres is we used to think most of what happened in the brain was what happened consciously. We're now discovering through a whole range of writers that most of what's happening is non-conscious, including all sorts of decision-making processes. But that leads some people to the emphasis that we're practically animals, that the basest part of our life is the lowest, the Pleistocene era part. But when you talk about the conscious expression of feeling, that gives you the chance to learn from feeling, and that really ennobles human beings and gives them much more control, even while understanding the importance of what's happening down here.
Right. Yeah, and it's actually a very important guide because, the issue with emotions is that even the most complex of the emotions go only so far in the solution of the problems of human beings in a very complex physical and cultural space. And what you have to do is invent solutions which can only come to collectives of conscious-minded individuals that will take care of problems that biology has not taken care taken care of until now. So you could, I like to see it in a sort of two-tiered way, although two-tiered makes it too simple, and it's much more than two tiers. But you can say that evolution has handed over to us a very rich automatic system to solve intelligently a whole slew of problems that we can be faced with. And then, because we have feeling and because we are conscious individuals and we have constructed a cultural history, and we have memory and we have records of the events, then we have the possibility of inventing other solutions. What I think is so fascinating is that the solutions that we invent in the social arena are largely modeled on solutions that biology at first hit upon. So I like to see it in terms of the idea of homeostasis. Homeostasis in a nutshell is the concept that we need, in order to survive, we need to regulate our life within certain parameters. For example, we're here at 8,000 feet, and we're not meant to be at 8,000 feet unless we've lived here all our lives. And there are lots of things that happen in terms of the pressure of oxygen that is going to change the way our acid-base mechanisms are operating, and our organisms are changing as rapidly as possible to adapt us to this new situation. And you have different effects of alcohol, different effects of exercise, very different than if you were at 5,000 feet or at 200 feet. And homeostasis is what automatically regulates us to achieve the possibility of surviving in spite of being put in situations that are not the ones where we normally would be most comfortable. Now, homeostasis has been incredibly successful, that's why we're here, and has its own set ways. We don't really interfere that much, and should not, in the way we regulate our circulation, our heart rhythm, and so on. We can interfere with it to a certain degree by training, exercise, all sorts of things, but fundamentally, nature is doing a beautiful job and succeeding. What we are not good at in terms of the basic biology is all the trouble, all the problems that come when you now have a society with many individuals, and those individuals are going to do things that can fundamentally harm others, or on the contrary, bring wellness to others. And that's when the conscious impulse is going to, in the invention, the imagination of a social space starts operating. And I like to call this social homeostasis, but I suspect that when we think about moral systems and ethical rules and law, jurisprudence in general, when we think about medicine, when we think about social and political systems, we are in fact thinking about homeostatic mechanisms, because the purpose through and through is to make life possible in a situation where in fact it might not, because you could have warfare, you could have all sorts of suffering caused by the wrong actions of a few on others, and so on. So we are still aiming now very consciously at the same set of problems that biology set out to solve millions of years ago, except that now we know a little bit about now we can interfere, with our own volition in the process. And I think the fact that when you read the headlines any day, you realize that things are not really going perfectly, simply means that this is a work in progress. We have succeeded in our basic biological homeostasis, but we're very far from succeeding in the general social homeostasis. Although I think
another ennobling theme, because a lot of and we've talked about this, a lot of the behavioral, some of the evolutionary people think survival is the end of human life, or our main goal is survival as long as we can pass along our genes. And I'm not sure what the Aspen Ideas Festival has to do with passing along our genes, why we're here, why we're motivated to do this. But when you talk about social homeostasis, you're talking about a much higher level of goals, which you've described as well-being.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think I might push it farther than you, that the desire to merge with other people, to achieve synchronicity or harmony with other people, is a primary goal of human nature, to be with other people, to be with people like us, to fall in love, and the ecstatic feelings that creates is the apotheosis, or the height of social well-being and the height of social homeostasis.
I think I would agree with you, and I think that probably by now we actually have at least the tendency to yearn for that and to seek that in our genes too. I mean, there's quite a lot of evidence that would go in that favor, and there's certainly human activities that do not seem to be terribly essential for gene passing, but are very important for all of us in this room, and they have to do with, for example, the arts. It's debatable that arts are adaptations and that really function in terms of strict survival in the Darwinian sense. Although I think one could argue that point, but I think I don't care. The subject doesn't interest me that much whether or not they're adaptations. They certainly are incredibly important, and they certainly are incredibly important in terms of generating well-being and all of those things that you have just talked about, human fellowship, for example. And of course, we know of something that has pretty much the same status, and that's religion. A lot of the religious impulse, I think, has exactly the same.
Some people have called the arts the education of the emotions. Do you believe it is possible to structure one's life, to educate one's emotions in a more elevated way as one goes through life? Or are these so basic that they're basically impermeable to whatever we do?
Oh, I think they're educable. I think that but you have to keep in mind that you really don't learn them to begin with. I mean, you don't learn fear and you don't learn joy. What you can do is educate better and better by reflection and repeated experience and reflection. You can establish better and better connections between certain emotions and certain causes of emotion. So, for example, if you think, I like the term emotionally competent stimulus. So we just to define, to call attention to the fact that emotions have causes. So you will react to a certain stimulus in a certain way. And of course, as I mentioned, the emotion is there as a potentiality. And it will or will not be triggered depending on whether or not you have an emotionally competent stimulus, something that can actually do it. Now, we cannot interfere on the side of the emotion package itself. That's a physiological given. You can, of course, interfere with the expression of the emotion. We know that in numerous cultures, there's an enormous effort to suppress the expression of emotion, which does not mean that the emotion disappears altogether. The fact that you might have a blank face rather than crying does not mean that inside you're not crying. And that does not mean that your other physiological reactions that are all in the interior of the organism are not still taking place. But you may have, through education, you may change the mask of a person the same way you change the mask of an actor. But what you can change for sure is how you connect certain stimuli with certain emotions, and it's totally in our control if we're going to be governed by things that we regard as beautiful and admirable, or things that are trite and stupid. And that job is totally in our control, because it's very important that we realize sometimes when you talk about emotion being a set physiological package, sometimes people get very alarmed and say, oh my God, you're saying that this is all the same for everyone, and that this is totally determined, and there's no way of personalizing it. And of course, this is not the case. If you would take this room, I will bet you that there are numerous stimuli that would cause fear or joy in many of you, but not in all of you. So one thing that we do customize and we make very, very particular for each and every one of us is exactly the kind of stimuli that are capable in our individual situation of producing an emotion. And David, you mentioned the arts. You can obviously surround yourself by the kind of poetry or the kind of music that will actually bring to you certain kinds of states. That's totally under your control.
Okay, in 2 minutes we're going to open the floor up to questions. And I also wanted to invite, if Hannah Damasio, who's a very important colleague, wants to chip in, I'd certainly welcome that. But the final topic before we get to that, you've written more recently about morality and how emotions affect moral decisions. And there is a school of thought, including Michael Gazzaniga, an important neuroscientist, that morality is essentially like aesthetics, that when we look at something, we have a visceral and immediate reaction to whether it is moral or immoral, good or bad. Is that your view? Is that consistent with how you think moral decisions are made?
With a part of it, yes. I mean, there's something, for example, there's someone whose work I like very much, Jonathan Haidt, who has basically that view for the beginning of the process. So a lot of our moral judgments, for example, deciding whether or not something is acceptable morally or not, can be engaged rather automatically on the basis of very old social emotions that we have. So there can be a sort of immediate reaction that is emotional. But I don't think that explains or accounts for the entire field of moral behavior. Because the point is that we may have been guided historically, long time ago, by those basic reactions, but then we were smart enough to invent other injunctions, to invent rules, and to ask people to behave according to those rules. I don't think that the laws or fine ethical principle are written in our genes. Although we do have, for example, when you look, just take something like social emotions like embarrassment and shame, or guilt, or compassion, you have moral values embedded there. And all you need to do is think about what those reactions cause. Why is it that, and of course these are, by the way, a reaction like compassion, or to a certain degree guilt or embarrassment is something that is not confined to the human species. You can find it in other primates. So clearly the evolution was already taking care of the beginnings, the forerunners of moral systems, in the form of emotions that could be engaged automatically and that could, for example, promote reciprocal altruism, which clearly has had a role that is very important in the evolution of biology. But then you have all this other stuff that we layered on top of it, and that comes from a lot of wisdom and a lot of reflection, and that actually varies very much culturally and varies very much with, for example, the kind of religion that one practices within a certain culture. And philosophically, there's sort of a classical opposition between Kantian views and Humean views. And in one case, you have views that are very much based on emotion. Hume had that idea that fundamentally emotions are going to guide you through, and I don't think that that's quite enough. And then you have the Kantian view, where he says, no, we actually have to put rules on this system, and there are things that may be difficult to do, but are ideal, and there's no reason why we should not strive to achieve those ideals. So I think that a view of the moral system that stays with the emotions only is going to be a rather limited one, and I don't think it's going to really serve.
So if I'm a Texan and I see income inequality of 100 to 1, and I'm not offended, but if I'm Swedish and I see it at 100 to 1, I'm completely offended. Is that offense? Is that moral judgment? Is that where in the realm of my morality is that in what you've just described?
Well, it's certainly the realm of a different culture that has been cooked up for a particular area, and where a sizable number of the inhabitants subscribe to those values. Yeah, you could call it moral, but I tend to be very traditional and think about moral in a somewhat other area, but that too. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay,
I'll take it.
If there are questions, there must be microphones somewhere in the house. I see one, too. So if there are questions, please approach a microphone. In the meantime, I wanted to come back to the automatic process, and that's to emphasize the wisdom of part of it and the fallacy of part of it. One of the important experiments you've done involves 2 packs of playing cards, and this is a test of the wisdom of some of the automatic emotional responses. Could you just quickly describe what that tells us about it?
Yeah. So that was an experiment that we did in the 1990s, known as the gambling task experiment, and pretty complicated, but in a nutshell, it involves different packs of cards, and there's a game that you play by picking up cards, and you're given very little instruction on what the game is. You're given one idea that picking up a card will bring in a certain amount of reward and a certain amount of penalty, but we're not going to tell you which deck is going to be good or bad, or going to be more or less advantageous. And the purpose of the game is to make as much money or lose as little money as possible. And the experiment begins with the experimenter lending money in a perfectly, sort of classical mortgage, nothing subprime here, lending money to the subject. And what happens is that people who are normal, who do not have brain damage, will go. By the way, there are 2 decks that are very advantageous and 2 decks that are fundamentally disadvantageous. And if you play on 2 of the decks, you're going to end up losing your shirt. If you are going to play on the other decks, you're going to end up making money and coming out ahead. And since you have very little information, this is a little bit like the game of life. You're handed a certain pack of cards, and you're going to have to learn by experience what is good and what is bad. That's why we designed it that way. So what happens is that normal individuals, fairly rapidly, there are only 100 plays that you can have, but sometimes within the first 20 or so, they are already veering towards the good decks. And they still do not know why, and all they have been given is the schedule of rewards or punishments. In other words, they have either made money or lost money. While that is happening, as the subjects are hooked to skin conductance monitoring, you realize that the brain is responding to the bad cards by sending an alarm signal, which corresponds to a differential electrophysiological response. And people are not aware at that point that they have the strategy to go into the good direction, nor do they feel the skin conductance response, because one of the interesting aspects of the skin conductance response, which is just a minimal alteration of the amount of water that you can have in your skin, they don't know that. So they don't know that that is happening, and yet it is happening, and it is a sign that there is something non-conscious that is biasing you in a certain direction. And of course, how did you get to be that wise and to be biased that way? By repeated exposure to certain situations of gains or losses and acquiring that wisdom, and then being able to deploy it, but in a non-conscious way. Just to conclude the story, if you take patients with ventromedial prefrontal damage, so that's that old part of the prefrontal cortex, and they play the game, not only do they play in a disadvantageous way, so they're going to be financial losers, but they also do not have any kind of skin conductance response that is differential. So you actually see that their brain is lacking that kind of response. But this, by the way, is not a response that is in the genes and is there in the given biology. It's a response that in normal individuals is gained through experience, is gained through learning. What's in the genes is the fact that we, for example, prefer gains to losses, and that we're going to make everything possible to maximize those gains. That's certainly a given of our nature.
Ma'am?
Thank you so much for being a pioneer. I think we're beginning to see more and more variables. One would be gender. Another, book written by a colleague at Georgetown, Candace Pert, The Molecules of Emotion. And I wonder what you're seeing on the horizon. Bruce Lipton wrote a book, The Biology of Belief, that's recent and contributes to what you're telling us. What do you see hormonally? I think I'll just speak for the women in the room. We do feel emotion based on hormonal levels. And so what is the new frontier that you see emerging through decision-making and emotions driven by other variables?
Right. It's a very interesting question. So what well, first of all, there are, of course, gender differences. Although when it comes to emotions, I think that the gender differences have more to do with style and intensity than with fundamental difference. In other words, I doubt very much that there is any emotion that women have that men don't have, and vice versa. I think that the range, the roster of possible emotions is the same, and all you need to think is what is the great cultists of emotion have been poets, playwrights, and novelists for ever since there was such a thing on the face of the earth. And so it's perfectly obvious that, and by the way, most of them were men for reasons that have to do also with obvious social facts. So I think that the range of possible emotions and their deployment, the system is the same, but the intensity and the style is, of course, quite different. And there's also another difference there, which has to do with culture. Which may be tied to it too. That's another story. Now, in decision-making, quite specifically, we already have evidence that, for example, the kinds of brain lesions that lead to altered decision-making in men and in women are actually different. So there are a couple of papers that have been published on this. More than a couple, probably a dozen papers that have been published on this, even in relation to the utilization of fear, for example, in these processes. There is a difference between women and men, and we'll probably come to learn far more about that. And of course, the hormonal aspect is a key here, because that is one aspect in which there are quite clear physiological differences. So more to be explored, more to come.
Hi, I work with senior level executives, and they are constantly being driven by making very difficult decisions. And I use neuroscience as the basis upon which I help them. And one of their major complaints is that they get in a situation and their emotions take over. And it could be very detrimental to the company. And what they come to me for is to help them at those crucial moments be able to get on top of their emotions, be able to get to stop their unconscious behavior and learn a new kind of a behavior. The way in which I work with them, and I'm very interested to know how you would fill in on this process, is I begin with the thinking and helping them in the prefrontal cortex and with their everyday thoughts to then go down into the unconscious and help change their emotions and that knee-jerk reaction so they can make better decisions.
Yeah. So the first thing to say to your question is that clearly emotions, if they're excessive, they're going to have a very disruptive effect on anything, including decisions, of course. Memory. There are all sorts of, it's quite interesting. Let me just give you an example which I think will fit and will be illustrative for the others. When you're in a learning situation, if you would be neutralized in your emotions, your learning situation, like, for example, for an exam, you would actually learn less than if you would have a moderate degree of emotion. If you have some emotion, a little bit of fear of the exam or excitement about the exam, probably will actually allow you to acquire more information. But if the emotion is extremely intense, and if you go into a situation of panic about the exam, your learning actually declines. And you see this, for example, in situations of what people remember after a traumatic event. So too little emotion is bad, too much emotion is bad as well. This sounds extremely banal, but you actually have to find somewhere in the middle the situation where you will be helped. So I think your executives should really be prevented from getting hysterical and doing wrong things on top of their, with their emotions in control. But don't give them so much Valium that they will be too calm. You need a little bit of tension.
Do you have breathing exercises you can help us with to get that golden level?
I wish that would be a very good marketing device.
You could afford a house here.
I think Sydney has a question.
Sydney.
I am Sidney Harmon, in less than full disclosure, a modest colleague, a great admirer. In your early exchange with David, you spoke about a way of thinking that used data out of the lab in original ways. And that brought Nobel Albert Einstein to mind. It's the essence of how he worked creatively. He said at one point that the most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and science. Would you talk to us for a minute about the mysterious?
Very good. That's wonderful. That's a tall order, but a good one. So first of all, thank you for bringing up Einstein, who had this reverence for the mysterious, and actually a reverence for reverence, which is very important. Because I think one thing that is critical, especially when you're talking about neuroscience, and you have all of these new, very fascinating results, all the latest new scan with lots of colors, and new revelations about our molecular operations and so on, there is a very big risk of losing the sense of reverence. And the risk of looking at this field of science as not only dehumanized but dehumanizing, because you're just sort of explaining everything and without having any kind of reserve for things that you ought to be reverent for. And so my first point in relation to reverence and mystery is that no matter how much we know about what is going on in the brain, the mystery remains. I mean, after all, we have to be modest and realize that we don't even understand how life is produced. We are understanding more and more about it, but we still don't understand how life is produced. So it's not that we are, we're successful, but it's not that we are a runaway success and we have explained everything. And then the other thing that happens is that if you are working, especially on something like the brain, and you are aware of what is going on, not just on the surface of the brain, but on neural systems, on for example, certain regions made up of cells hooked in a certain way, and aware of the cells themselves. What we find is a world of marvel. No matter how much we know about what is going on there, in terms of what is going on in the nucleus of the cell or in the cytoplasm, and the marvelous relationships between this unit and the other units, the only thing you can be is in awe. And it is still mysterious, and you have to be in awe, you have to be in reverence of the incredible complexity that you're dealing with. And you also become, especially if you realize that most of our activity is in all likelihood non-conscious, and that we have this little aperture of vision over what we are, you have to realize that whatever we know is small, and we have plenty of mystery to last probably hundreds of Aspen festivals of ideas into the future. One more thing on Einstein, and that is it actually connects with Spinoza, who happens to be one of my favorite philosophers, a very hermetic philosopher, not exactly bedtime reading, but he was full of incredible insights, and it's probably no coincidence that he was Einstein's favorite philosopher as well, and that Einstein's attitude towards science and by the way towards anything that could be conceived as divine was very much Spinozian. And final point, Einstein was very aware of his emotions, which is very interesting. When you think about Einstein with his brilliant work in physics and mathematics, and you think, well, this is obviously a hyper-cognitive person concerned with facts, measurements, numbers. Not so. He was actually, he's a person that talked about equations as being beautiful or ugly. And he talked about his mode of thinking as being muscular and related to emotional states, which is really quite remarkable. So he was not only a good user, but he was very aware that there was something there that also, of course, also transmitted to his other passion, which was music. Yeah.
Just a few minutes left, so we'll do these two questions.
At the Ideas Festival, we've had a whole track on Darwin, and I think with the change in government, it's being decriminalized that we can talk about evolution. Your work in terms of tying it to morality or to religion, I'm just curious if you've taken the time to try to understand the biological evolutionary thought that might be about the creation of emotion and what part it's playing in the sociology. We're also getting a lot of information here about these kind of tracks of global warming, of thinking globally, acting locally and thinking globally, and I'm just curious if we have the biology to be able to make a transition like that with emotions and neurology.
Well, I think in relation to emotions, here's something one can say with some confidence. Emotions, the term emotion is a little bit of a grab bag, and it hides a number of phenomena, a number of processes that you could itemize as follows: reward and punishment systems, drives, motivations, and basic life regulation. All of those things are under the term of emotion. When we talk about an emotion such as fear or pride or what have you, we were talking about the sort of the most developed, the most refined aspect of that automated action program to solve a certain problem. But you have all these other routines that are there before. And when you think in evolutionary terms, and you think about, for example, a single cell that would be, in a world millions and millions of years ago, and you think about what if in fact there is this totally non-conscious, non-minded, quote-unquote, desire of the genes to remain and be passed on, what would the genes, sounds like an absurd question, but it's not. What would the genes do in order to create organisms that would be the most effective to pass on themselves? And the answer is emotion becomes very, very high with all of these things like reward and punishment mechanisms and drives and motivations, because emotions are that sort of automatic intelligence that would guide an organism to do the most convenient thing for that organism to survive during the time that its genome would allow it to survive. So very early on, emotion must have been one of the very first things to develop. So we're really dealing with something that is now part and parcel of our lives, but has been here for a long, long time. And that, of course, is part of the problem, because we need to deal with this very old system that has all sorts of misleading cues, but also very useful ones. And then you have to layer on top of it this new thing that we have evolved with cultures and civilizations that will allow us to be more pointed and create the best possible behavior. But I think that what evolution gave us very rapidly was different kinds of behaviors that were all of the processes, that were all of the emotion flavor. And they made life more possible for a longer period, first for single cells, then for small multicellular organisms, and eventually for complex creatures like we are. And it's good that Darwin has been decriminalized, isn't it?
I came here to stay away from politics. But
As a human being and a psychotherapist, I was drawn to the book Emotional Awareness, which is a elongated conversation between the Dalai Lama and Paul Ekman, who is probably the world's expert on emotion and facial expression. And there was a very long portion of the book, which was the dialogue about how difficult it is for both Westerners and even Easterners who are practicing meditation for long periods of time to be able to build in that delay between the experience of emotion and reactivity. And I think that so much of what goes wrong, whether it's a small interaction between people or large major things that go wrong with the homeostasis, seems to or could depend on being able to elongate that place between an experience coming in and how it is going to be responded to as opposed to reacted to. So I guess I'm wondering if you would comment on that, because it seems to be a major stumbling block for most people.
Yeah, I think it would depend, of course, on the kind of emotion that you're reacting to. So there are certain aspects that would probably not be a great problem. There's certain some of the most complex social emotions. I think the more we intervene between the deployment of the emotion and further later actions, the better. Let me give you an example. We have recently concluded a study. This was just published in the Proceedings of the National Academy 2 months ago, in which we analyzed different kinds of compassion, something that the Dalai Lama likes. We talked a lot about that. And one of them is compassion for physical pain, and the other is compassion for mental pain. Now, this is very interesting because you may say, what's the big difference? What's the big deal? The deal is huge, because we know that non-human species are compassionate for physical pain. So, if a dog walks by another animal or by a human that is in physical pain, the dog may well lick the other creature in a response that denotes some kind of response. In other words, there was an emotionally competent stimulus, which was the predicament, physical predicament of another living creature, and there is a response. I'm not arguing here about whether or not the dog is thinking, oh my God, he's suffering, let me give him a lick. I don't think that that's what happens, but that's the response that you see. Now, will the dog be very compassionate, or the monkey or the chimpanzee, if you have lost your house to foreclosure, or if you have lost a loved one to cancer? And the answer is no. So there's something very interesting that is taking place here that has to do with different points at which certain kinds of situation enter the repertoire of evolution and allow the brain to respond. And so now we know that we definitely respond to mental anguish in a very interesting way, and we do have compassion. And we also know something which is in this study, and that is that it takes longer for the brain to organize the response to mental pain than the response for physical pain. And this is quite beautiful. We're talking about the internal brain response being offset by something like 6 seconds. Now, 6 seconds is fast by the likes of us, but in brain time is eternity. Just use. It takes 5 milliseconds for a neuron to fire. So this is big time. So here it is, this huge difference. So it's I think your question aims at something like this. We're going to be able to know more and more about what's different in the way we respond to these different situations, and then be able to intervene at that point and create something which may be better and beautiful. And once again, it's not just dealing with what genetics gave us, which is fine to begin with, and not so fine sometimes. It's also what we're going to be bringing to the biology, which is, of course, what we're here for. And I think that's a very important point to emphasize.
Okay, well, after each of your 6 seconds after each of your sentences, I've experienced a jolt of social pleasure. Sometimes 8 seconds, I'm slow that way. I should mention, which I didn't mention at the beginning, that you direct the Brain and Creativity Institute at USC, and Hannah directs the Neuroimaging Center at USC. So we should give some props to the Trojans and to the USC. And thank you, Antonio.
Thank you.